My name is Orla. I am 29 years old, and the night my father finally learned to fear paper started with him laughing at me in a ballroom full of people who had spent half their lives applauding my sister. We were at the 10-year anniversary gala of our family's luxury wedding estate. My father, David, lifted his crystal champagne glass, looked straight at me, and said, "Orla just works a boring spreadsheet job. She will never have the excellence and aesthetic brilliance of her sister." The room laughed because that was what everyone always did when he used me as the punchline. My younger sister, Lilia, smiled into the spotlight like she had been born in it. I stood there in heels that were already killing my feet after a 14-hour shift at the financial auditing firm, holding an untouched drink, and felt something inside me go completely still. Then I heard myself say, "Then tell her to pay the mortgage. I am not sending money anymore." My father actually scoffed. He looked around the room, enjoying the attention, and said, "What money? We have never received a single dollar from you." That was the moment the laughter stopped sounding humiliating and started sounding temporary. He thought I would argue. He thought I would cry. He thought I would do what I had done my entire life, swallow the insult to protect the family and let him walk away with the last word. I did not. I said nothing. Before I tell you what I placed on his desk and how his glittering empire collapsed into dust, tell me what time it is for you right now and where you are watching from. I am curious to see how far the shock wave of a brutal boundary will travel. I grew up in a family that treated reputation like a religion. David ran the luxury wedding venue, a business that wealthy couples and high society event planners had trusted for decades. My mother, Lorna, curated the charity luncheons and every polished social ritual that made people say our family had pure class. Lilia was their masterpiece. She was a wedding planner and a lifestyle influencer, floating from floral sponsorships to bridal magazine shoots. I was the other one, the dependable one. The one who worked in financial audit, caught errors, cleaned messes, and knew exactly how expensive appearances really were. My father loved telling people I had a practical streak, which sounded harmless until you heard the way the room always softened for Lilia and tightened for me. What nobody in that ballroom knew was that the luxury wedding estate should have folded 3 years earlier. One catastrophic vendor penalty, one massive property insurance increase, one payroll gap my father swore would fix itself. Then another, then another. The first time he called me, it sounded temporary, but Monday became the following month. Then came tax season, then the premium on my mother's vintage house. Lilia never saw any of that. She posted photos of gracious living while I sat in my apartment, reconciling overdue invoices and wiring my own money into accounts I was never supposed to be responsible for. Neither of my parents ever said thank you when the transfer went through. They thought I was just paying bills. They did not know that 3 years ago, to prevent a complete bank foreclosure, I used my entire life savings to legally purchase the actual property deed. I had personally covered $215,400 in taxes, payroll, and even the retainer for the lawyer Lilia needed after a nasty contract dispute. David truly believed he was the untouchable king of the estate. He had absolutely no idea he was just a guest living on my charity, and he had just publicly mocked his own landlord. The drive back to my apartment was completely silent. I did not turn on the radio. I did not pull over to the side of the road to cry. I was entirely too angry to cry. If you have ever wanted to say one honest sentence in a room full of liars, you know exactly how quiet the body gets right before impact. But I had already made the impact. Now I needed to build the guillotine. I unlocked my door, kicked off my heels, walked straight into my home office, and opened my laptop. I did not bother turning on the overhead lights. The cold glow of my dual monitors was enough. As a financial auditor, my entire professional life is built on the undeniable truth of ledgers. People can weave elaborate delusions. Narcissists like my father can convince entire ballrooms that they are titans of industry. But a spreadsheet does not care about your ego, your tailored suit, or your applause. It only cares about balance. And for 3 long years, my family's ledger had been violently unbalanced. I stared at a master directory on my desktop that I had maintained for 36 months without ever fully admitting to myself why I was building it. Inside it were dozens of subfolders categorized by month, and then by category: estate mortgage rescue, property tax advance, venue liability insurance gap, Lilia public relations emergency, Lilia vendor settlement. Every single time I had told myself that my family would eventually appreciate me, I had saved one more receipt just in case. I had bank confirmations, screenshots of frantic text messages from David, emails begging for temporary loans, cashier check scans, and late notices that I had intercepted before the banks could initiate foreclosure procedures. But the most devastating document in that system was not a receipt. It was a heavy, watermarked piece of paper that I had scanned into a secure, encrypted vault 3 years ago. It was the absolute, unencumbered property deed to the luxury wedding estate. It was registered exclusively under my name, tied directly to my personal, legal, and financial liability. My father truly believed that running the day-to-day operations, shaking hands with wealthy clients, and hosting the parties made him the owner. He had never grasped the legal reality that the ground he stood on, the walls that echoed his laughter, and the roof that sheltered his fake empire belonged entirely to the daughter he had just humiliated. The steady mechanical hum of my laser printer broke the silence of the room. I loaded a fresh ream of paper and began to print. Page after page spilled onto my oak desk. I printed the payroll bridge transfers. I printed the property tax installments. I printed the itemized credit card statements showing Lilia's imported silk dresses and expensive floral arrangements, all paid for by the emergency corporate card that I personally guaranteed. I took every single page, carefully organized them by date and category, and placed them inside a thick, heavy red folder. Rage can be argued with, and tears can be dismissed. But a clean ledger with signatures, dates, and transfer identification numbers is a blade. Then, I looked at the clock. It was exactly 2 in the morning. It was time to stop being the invisible safety net. I logged into the corporate banking portal. I navigated to the automatic transfer settings that I had established from my personal savings account to cover their chronic shortfalls. With one click, I canceled the scheduled draft for the upcoming estate mortgage payment. Next, I accessed the commercial credit line. I removed my signature as the primary financial guarantor, effectively freezing the account and triggering an immediate review by the lending institution. Finally, I completely severed the connection between my personal funds and the venue's operating accounts. I did not touch anything illegally. I did not steal a single cent. I merely stopped doing the one thing my father confidently claimed I had never done in the first place. I just removed the invisible net I had stretched beneath all of them. I sat back in my chair and stared at the red folder on my desk. The exhaustion of a 14-hour workday was completely gone, replaced by the cold, clear adrenaline of a finalized decision. The real betrayal was not just that David had mocked my career. It was that he had mocked me while standing on money I had sent. He humiliated me from a stage built entirely with my labor. Lilia's glowing smile, my mother's polished elegance, my father's arrogant toasts, every bit of it only existed because I kept covering the rot. When the sun rose, I went to work at my auditing firm without checking whether the venue had enough cash to survive the week. For the first time in 3 years, their survival was absolutely none of my business. By noon the next day, my mother had called 6 times, Lilia 3, and my father not at all. That meant he was angry enough to think his silence would scare me. Instead, it gave me room to breathe. When Monday morning arrived, the payroll company must have called David before 9. I knew this because he finally called me at 9 in the morning for the first time since the anniversary gala, and there was absolute panic hiding just beneath his anger. I did not answer. Around 4 in the afternoon, my mother finally sent the message she thought would pull me back into line. It read, "Sunday dinner. We will discuss this as a family. Be reasonable. Be reasonable." That phrase had haunted my entire life. In my family, being reasonable meant taking less, giving more, and never forcing anyone else to feel ashamed of their own incompetence. I decided I was going to attend, but I was not going to bring the entire heavy red folder. I was only bringing copies, not originals. Sunday evening, I walked into my parents' historic house with one slim envelope in my bag and one hard truth in my chest. The dining room looked exactly like it always had, silver polished, candles lit, and my mother's best china glowing in warm light, as if the room itself had never heard a raised voice. Lilia was already there, sitting in a cream dress, looking soft and wounded for effect. My father sat at the head of the table with the stiff posture he used whenever he planned to punish someone politely. He started his lecture before the salad plates were even cleared. "You created a scene at a public event," he said, his voice dripping with disappointment. "You owe your sister an apology." Lilia lowered her eyes perfectly on cue, and my mother dabbed at the corner of her mouth with a linen napkin. It would have been funny if it were not so heavily practiced. I set my silver fork down. "I am not apologizing for telling the truth," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "What truth? That you have built some fantasy where you are supporting everyone?" There it was again, denial delivered with absolute confidence. It is the kind of lie that only works when the victim keeps cooperating. "Not a fantasy," I said quietly. "A ledger." My father slapped one hand lightly on the mahogany table. "You are not going to sit in my house and accuse us of using you." His voice rose sharply on the last word, and something inside me settled even more deeply. "Good. Let him be loud." Loud people stop thinking. I pulled the envelope from my bag and slid one single page across the table to him. It was not the full binder, just the summary page. Date, category, amount, and destination. He glanced down with the bored contempt of a man who was absolutely sure he was about to dismiss me, but his eyes stopped halfway through the first line. Estate mortgage bridge. Property tax installment. Lilia public relations retainer. Venue insurance catch-up. Vendor settlement. His fingers tightened around the edges of the paper. My mother leaned over, read just enough to lose the color in her face, and sat back fast. Lilia whispered, asking what it was. I answered without looking at her. "The part I am willing to show you in private, before I show the rest in public." The room went completely still. My father tried to scoff again, but the sound cracked halfway out of his throat. "These are manipulated," he said, speaking entirely too fast. "These are not obligations. These are just things you offered." "Say that again," I told him, looking directly into his eyes. "Say in front of all of us that you never received a single dollar from me." He did not. He couldn't, because sometimes the most humiliating thing is not being exposed. It is being forced to sit in the absolute silence after your lie dies. I stood up before dessert was even served. "The next payroll issue is yours," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "The next insurance draft is yours. The next tax notice is yours. Lilia's vendor contracts are hers." I am done. As I walked out, I did not look back. I left the summary page sitting next to his untouched wine glass. Welcome to Absolute Karma. Can we just pause and talk about the absolute audacity of this man? He is literally staring at the exact ledger that saved his family, yet he chooses denial with absolute confidence. It makes my blood boil. He would rather sit in the humiliating silence of a dying lie than simply say thank you to his own daughter. But listen to me. If you think Orla dropping that single summary page on the table was savage, you are not ready for what happens next. David thinks he can sweep this under the rug and play billionaire at his upcoming VIP investor showcase. He has absolutely no idea Orla is about to walk into that room with the original property deed. Grab your popcorn, guys, because the absolute public destruction of his fake empire is happening right now. That afternoon, sitting in my quiet office, I realized the story was no longer just about family disrespect. It had become about federal fraud by omission. While reviewing the venue's external financial disclosures, I noticed a terrifying pattern. David had been taking my emergency transfers and recording them internally as owner-backed liquidity. He was actively using my money to keep the luxury wedding estate afloat while presenting himself to external lenders as a wealthy, self-financing patriarch holding the business together. Even uglier, he had been letting Lilia charge her expensive brand development lifestyle to the corporate card, all while telling me the venue could not survive the winter without my direct support. It was a performance built entirely on my silence. And the grand finale of that performance was already on the calendar for Thursday night, the VIP Investor Showcase. David had invited half of the city's old money, including 2 major investment fund directors, to the estate. He was desperately trying to secure a $2 million expansion loan to build a second venue. Lorna loved the showcase because it photographed beautifully. Lilia loved it because it put her in a room where she could play the brilliant creative director. David loved it because he could pretend he was still an untouchable king. A private exposure at Sunday dinner had given them one final chance to tell the truth. Instead, they had spent the next 2 days trying to bully me back into submission. That decided it. I expanded the red folder. Not to be cruel for sport, but to make their denial mathematically and legally impossible. I divided the heavy binder into 5 distinct sections. Section 1, personal transfers by date and destination. Section 2, payroll, tax, and insurance gaps I had covered. Section 3, Lilia's luxury expenses billed through the business. Section 4, the legal notice of my formal withdrawal from all future financial support. Section 5, the absolute, watermarked property deed proving I was the sole legal owner of the estate. The first page alone was enough to drain the color from a face. The rest was a slow drowning. I packed the binder into a leather tote that suddenly felt heavier than any suitcase I had ever carried. It was not fear making it heavy, it was finality. The showcase glittered the way expensive hypocrisy always does: brass railings, white linen, older men laughing loudly, and women in diamonds speaking softly. I arrived exactly 10 minutes late on purpose, just late enough for the room to settle, for David to feel safe, and for Lilia to be fully visible in her performance. Lorna saw me first and went completely pale. David saw the heavy leather tote second and went paler. Lilia actually took one involuntary step back. Good, I thought. Let the fear arrive before I even speak. David came toward me with a smile stretched so tight it looked physically painful. "We are not doing this here," he murmured through clenched teeth. I smiled back. "You did it here first," I said. "At the gala, remember?" Dinner began. Toasts were made and glasses clinked. Lilia was introduced as the creative soul of the expansion project. Finally, David stood up to thank everyone for supporting a family business built on hard work, sacrifice, and absolute integrity. That word integrity landed in the room like a lit match near gasoline. I stood up before he could sit back down. People noticed immediately, because quiet accountants are not supposed to interrupt that kind of man in that kind of room. "Actually," I said, my voice calm enough to make a microphone unnecessary, "before we celebrate integrity, my father should correct something he said publicly last week." Every head in the room turned. Lilia whispered for me to stop. I did not even look at her. I looked only at David. "At the anniversary gala, you told a room full of people you never received a single dollar from me," I said. Murmurs rippled through the tables. Lorna half rose from her chair, her voice shaking. I walked straight to the table where the 2 lead investors were sitting. I lifted the heavy red folder and dropped it onto the white linen with a hard, flat sound that cut through the entire ballroom. "Now is perfect," I said. I opened to page 1 and turned it toward David. "Estate mortgage bridge, 17,400. Venue insurance gap, 8,300. Property tax installment, 12,200. Lilia's public relations retainer, 6,000. My father's mouth actually opened before any sound came out. He looked at me, then at the room, which was now watching him instead of admiring him. "These are manipulated," he said, speaking entirely too fast. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply flipped to Section 4 and Section 5. I slid the documents directly across the table to the lead investment director. "This is formal notice that I am no longer covering any business or personal obligations for this family, effective immediately," I told the investors. "Anything represented to you tonight as owner-backed liquidity was my money, not theirs. It is gone. Furthermore, here is the absolute property deed. The ground you are currently standing on belongs exclusively to me." That was the terrifying part. Not the accusation, not the family drama, but the abrupt, cold realization spreading across the faces of powerful men that the money under David's swagger had been an absolute illusion. The lead investor looked at the deed, then looked at the financial gaps. He did not yell. He did not ask David for an explanation. He simply closed the red folder, stood up, and said very quietly, "This meeting is over." Lorna covered her face with her hands. Lilia looked like she wanted to scream but was too conscious of the witnesses watching her. David just sat there, utterly colorless, blinking at the first page of the folder as if the numbers might miraculously rearrange themselves into mercy. The collapse was not instant, but it was fast enough to feel merciful after years of slow humiliation. Within 2 weeks, the $2 million expansion deal was completely dead. Without my financial shielding, and with the investors suddenly asking terrifyingly specific questions, the luxury wedding estate missed 3 major obligations in a row. Payroll froze, 2 longtime event coordinators quit. Lilia's polished influencer image shattered almost immediately. The premium floral vendors she had publicly bragged about working with suddenly switched her accounts to cash on delivery. Worse for her, the fiancé, who had always loved being adjacent to the estate's prestige more than he loved Lilia herself, quietly postponed their wedding, then vanished behind a public statement about needing honesty in a marriage. I did not answer my phone when Lilia called, sobbing about betrayal. I had run out of sympathy for women who only recognized cruelty once it reached them. My father did try one final ambush. He waited outside my auditing firm on a humid Tuesday evening, his shoulders bent and his expensive suit wrinkled, looking older than I had ever seen him. For one dangerous second, the little girl in me wanted to believe age had brought humility. Then he spoke. "You made your point," he said. "You can stop now." Not an apology, not an admission that he was wrong, just a demand to turn off the truth because he had suffered enough embarrassment. I told him the truth had never needed my permission. It had only needed my silence, and he had already spent that. He asked me if I really wanted to see him lose everything. I looked at the man who had used me as a punchline for his entire life and said, "You should have asked yourself that before you built everything on me," and laughed while doing it. He looked like I had struck him, not with my hand, but with the one thing he never thought I would weaponize against him: absolute accuracy. I did not just let his fake business fail. I sent the formal legal eviction notice. 30 days later, David, Lorna, and Lilia were legally removed from the premises. But I did not sell the historic property to a hospitality group for a massive profit. As the sole legal owner of the property deed, I filed the necessary municipal paperwork and transformed the luxury wedding venue into a residential shelter and vocational training center for women escaping domestic and financial abuse. I took the exact ballroom where my father had mocked my career, and I opened the doors to empower people who actually needed a safety net. I shattered his hollow legacy to build a living, breathing sanctuary. In my new director's office, I framed the first page of that property deed. I did not hang it there because I missed the pain, but because I never want to forget how close I came to spending my entire life being useful to people who found me disposable. Welcome back to the studio. Take a deep breath. Before we unpack the psychology of tonight's story, I want to be clear that we explore these dark dynamics of familial financial abuse strictly for educational awareness, not as professional, legal, or psychological advice. But the human element we just witnessed is undeniable. The most devastating revenge does not have to scream to be effective. Sometimes it just has to arrive tabbed, time-stamped, and impossible to explain away. David and Lorna built their entire arrogant reality on the assumption that their designated family scapegoat would never bite back. But Orla realized a profound psychological truth. Leniency given to a narcissist is just active complicity in your own destruction. When toxic people drain your resources while simultaneously degrading your worth, cutting off their supply is not cruel. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. So, I leave you with this question tonight. If your own family only respected you after you stopped saving them, would you ever go back? Or would you let the silence teach them what your love never could? If you have ever had to make the terrifying decision to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace and your future, share your story in the comments below. Your bravery might be the exact blueprint someone else needs to finally walk out their door tonight. Stay strong, protect your boundaries, and trust your absolute karma.